Good evening. My name is Justin Stearns. I run the Arab Crossroads Studies program here at New York University, Abu Dhabi, and I'd very much like to welcome you this evening. This evening's lecture is part of a collaboration that's come about with the very generous support of the NYU Abu Dhabi Institute, a series of 4 lectures over the academic year of 2014-2015 on the subject of religious diversity in Islam. The first lecture that we had a few months ago was by Tariq Jamil and was on Sunni-Shi'a relationships in sort of medieval Baghdad. Tonight, we're very fortunate to be joined by Professor Najam Haider, who comes to us from Barnard College, who is going to talk to us about the beginnings of Shi'ism. And it gives me special pleasure to introduce Najam this evening because as I was reflecting upon this the other day, an increasing sign that I, too, am beginning to advance in years. Najam and I first met 19 years ago. It's really scary when you begin to start talking about people you've known for 2 decades. In a seminar on the Mongols in which we, for some reason, started shouting at each other across the seminar table. I can't remember why, but we were very invested in the subject. Today, however, he has advanced far beyond arguing with me to being an assistant professor of religion at Barnard College with 2 books to his name. His specialty is on the early history of Shi'ism, and that is what he is going to talk to us about tonight, but he has also written extensively about questions of historiography in classical Islamic thought, as well as on the subject of alcohol and the permission to drink it or not, which is always a subject of great interest. But with that, I would like to invite Najam to come up and to speak to us and to remind you that we have an official presentation of about 40 to 50 minutes, followed by a question and answer period. Thank you very much.
First of all, I wanted to thank the Institute for the invitation, the opportunity to come here and speak. I'd also like to point out that the reason I was yelling at Justin was because Justin was wrong, and I was correct. My talk today is going to be on Shi'ism, and it's a little bit complicated because, I guess the one message I would ask you to take away from this talk, and it's always great to start off that way as opposed to ending that way, is that things are very complicated. And part of our problem is that we tend to seek and we prefer and would like simple explanations, and simple explanations don't usually work. And so I apologize, this is also by way of an apology for the slog that I'm going to have to put you through over the next 50 minutes. But I do think that it'll be worth it in the end. Now, I want to begin by looking at some origin narratives. And I do have this up here, but I truly dislike PowerPoint. But I do believe that it would be somewhat useful to you, so humor me with this. The first origin narrative, first thing I want to do actually before I even get into the beginnings of Shi'ism is talk about what we think, where we think Shi'ism comes from, where we think Shi'i identity emerged and how we think it emerged. And usually there are a number of narratives that are given straight off. And these are narratives that are pretty prevalent in the media. They're very prevalent amongst normal people. My mom knows these narratives. These are narratives that are fairly widespread. And the first one, and this is the one you're probably most familiar with, is the death of the prophet narrative. And so there's this idea that's perpetuated everywhere, that Shi'ism and Sunnism break apart after the death of the prophet. The prophet dies in 632, and one group decides that Ali is the rightful successor, and the other group decides that Abu Bakr is the rightful successor. And on the basis of this, these 2 communities break apart. Then we have Shia, and then we have Sunni, and these 2 polarized communities are forever divided in eternal conflict against each other. Now, I'm sure when Tariq was here, those of you who were here for Tariq's Jamil's presentation, he probably made it clear that that wasn't necessarily the case. It's much more complicated than that. But this narrative of the death of the prophet dividing these 2 communities so distinctly into polarized, opposing camps is fairly prevalent. It's probably the most prevalent. Now, the second narrative is the Abdullah ibn Sabah narrative. Now, this is, again, I'm not saying that these are correct narratives. In fact, I'm saying they're not. But these narratives are out there. And the Abdullah ibn Sabah narrative falls into the category of polemic, very strong polemic. It's a polemic that argues that Shi'ism begins when a particular convert to Islam tries to undermine Islam by creating an offshoot, that being Shi'ism, that centers on a deification of Ali. Now, that's the Abdullah ibn Sabah narrative. This narrative was very popular polemically, in polemics, in the pre-modern period. You find this very early on, and it continues almost to this day. Certain categories of people, certain communities point that out. This is the Abdullah ibn Sabah narrative. This is Shi'ism is an outside creation that is in some way undermining true Islam. Now, the third narrative is the Safavid theory. This is the idea that prior to the Safavid Empire, which took over Iran in 1501 under Shah Ismail and ruled for a couple of 100 years, prior to the Safavid period, Shi'ism was just a kind of benign pro-Ali sentiment. That what it meant to be Shia prior to 1500 was that you had a particular love for the family of the Prophet. You believed that Ali was the rightful successor, probably, but you didn't go too far with it. And there was very little animosity. It was just sort of a pro-Ali sentiment. But when the Safavids showed up in 1501 and Shah Ismail showed up and took over Iran, the Safavids perpetuated a type of Shi'ism that was far more polarizing. This idea is manifest and put forward by lots of groups today. So for example, the argument would be prior to the Safavid period, ritual differences were minimal. Prior to the Safavid period, the belief in Ali and the other Imams wasn't nearly as pronounced as it is today. Prior to the Safavids, the types of mourning rituals we see on Ashura for commemorating Hussein's massacre in Karbala weren't huge. They were just very small things. It was a sober Shi'ism prior to the Safavids, and the Safavids create something very, very different. So these are three narratives. I put these out there because these occur in the general milieu. This is what people think. These show up oftentimes in the media. These are found in different communities. You might not have heard of all three of these, but chances are you've heard of at least the first. But the other two are prevalent. The second being more prevalent than the third in the pre-modern period. But the other thing I would point out is the second and third of these also ascribe Shi'ism a foreign origin. The idea being that it was either Iranian in the case of the Safavids or a Jewish incursion in the case of Abdullah ibn Sabah. So we have these sort of polemical views of where Shi'ism began. Now, what I'm going to do today is talk a little bit about what we know and what we don't know about early Shi'ism. And as I pointed out early on, it's going to be complicated. It's not going to be simple. We're going to talk a little bit about how Shi'ism emerges, and what I can say and what I will present will be shaped to a large extent by the sources that we have. Now, the first thing to bear in mind, many of you may already know this, is that we have very few sources for the first century of Islam. We have the Quran. We have some documents that we think can go back to the first century. The provenance is fairly established. We have other types of evidence, coins, inscriptions, things like that. But we have very few historical sources. So what I say about the first century is going to be somewhat conjectural. But I'm going to present it as if it's not. So I'm putting that out there. What I'm going to say is going to be kind of bare, but at the same time, what I'm saying is probably reflects the consensus of the broad scholarly community today. And you'll see, it's both dry and surprisingly bare at the same time. The second thing I'm going to do is to turn to the second century. In the second century, our sources begin to proliferate. And finally, I'll talk a little bit about the third century. So what I'm going to do here is go from, go chronologically from the first century to the second century to the third century. There's some overlap, but I'll point that out as we go along. So I want to start off with the first century. And I'm going to talk about the personal bond of charismatic loyalty. Now, in order to do this properly, I have to give you some history. And this history can, at times, be dull, but I will try to make it as exciting as possible. And it has to do with social groups. What we know about early Islam largely centers on tribalism, or to a large extent on tribalism. The idea being that the primary organizing principle of the Muslim state early on was along tribal lines. Now, the Prophet dies in 632. At that point, the community looks a very particular way. There are two major confederations that seem to exist. The first are the Ansar, the other are the Muhajirun. And the Muhajirun are the members of the tribe of Quraysh who come to Medina with the Prophet. The Ansar are the helpers in Medina who helped the Prophet. Now, when the Prophet dies, it's unclear who the successor is going to be, we think. But the Ansar seem to support Ali. We have some indications of this. There's an idea that Ali was seen as the member of the tribe of Quraysh that the Ansar would be most willing to accept. But somehow Abu Bakr did become the first caliph. And in order for this to happen, a very careful balance had to be reached. And that balance was that Abu Bakr and Umar had to make the case that the caliphate should stay with the tribe of Quraysh, but it should not go to the clan of Hashim within the tribe of Quraysh. And Abu Bakr made that case successfully. And so we have the first caliph, Abu Bakr. Now, after Abu Bakr, and Abu Bakr's reign or caliphate was quite small, we have Umar. Now, Abu Bakr and Umar together created a type of social structure, a state that was based primarily on this idea of sabiqa, Islamic precedence. The idea being that if you became Muslim earlier, then in some ways your status was higher. And so Umar created a whole system whereby when conquests happened in the Muslim world and monies were paid out, spoils were distributed, if you were an early convert and you took part early on in those battles, then you would receive a greater stipend than someone who came later. And this created this had a very particular social effect, because those who had converted earlier, for the most part, weren't those who were located high up in tribal structures. They weren't the nobility. There were other people. That's not to say that some of the early converts didn't have tribal standing, but many didn't. And so those are the people who were given positions of authority and power. And at this point, Islam was spreading. It was geographically spreading. Now, after Umar, we had Uthman. And now Uthman reversed this to a great degree. Uthman was that rare figure who both had tribal nobility. He was from the clan of the Umayyads, the dominant clan of the Quraysh. And at the same time, he was also an early convert. In the last 6 years of his rule, Uthman began to implement a policy that was quite different from what Umar had done. He got rid of this notion of sabiqa to a large extent, and he replaced it by reinscribing the authority of those individuals who had tribal standing. So suddenly those people who had not had authority in the time of Umar found themselves now in positions of authority. But the consequence of this was those people who had benefited under Umar felt in some ways disenfranchised. They had been robbed of their rightful position. And so that's the context that leads to the murder of Uthman in 656. And those disenfranchised people, those early converts who didn't have any standing really other than their conversion to Islam early on, those people turned to Ali. And so then Ali's, from 656 to 661, was the fourth caliph, but that period was marked by continuous internal struggles. All right, the world at the time when Ali comes to power is very different from the world at the time when the Prophet dies. The social categories have shifted. Different things have begun to happen. And the way one might want to think about it is by using this term, the piety-minded. Okay, the world has changed. Now, what I'm presenting now is sort of a model and a term that a historian from Chicago first introduced. It's this idea of Marshall Hodgson. And the idea is that different communities began to emerge, and those divisions, the divisions that had been in place at the time of the Prophet's death, were now replaced by new divisions. Now, one of those groups we've already spoken about, early Muslims with sabiqa. These are people who converted early on. They backed Ali very strongly. We also had non-Arab Muslims for the first time, large numbers of non-Arab Muslims. Okay, especially in Kūfa, which is one of the centers for this, Kūfa being close to the current-day city of Najaf in Iraq. Now, these two groups, non-Arab Muslims and early Muslims who had converted early, that's what I mean with sabiqa, they believed in perpetuating or creating an order that was based on Islam, a universal order. So they were really invested in this idea that you take the principles of the Quran and you make a universal sort of way of life from it, in which distinctions between tribes were not nearly as important as the fact that everybody was part of a Muslim community. Now, you can understand why the non-Arab Muslims wanted to do that, because they wanted to get rid of these distinctions based on tribe. They wanted their Muslim identity to count and really count up front, to be one of the most important things. And for the early Muslims with sabiqa, their very membership in the community was based upon their early conversion. So they felt very invested in this as well. And these groups came together and created what we think of as the piety-minded. Now these, I want to point out, are not Shia, okay? These are groups of people who backed Ali. Both groups seem to have backed Ali, early on at least. But what they were invested in is a universal vision of Islam. From this group, we also get Sunnism, and I'll try to come back to that by the end of my talk today. Now, when Ali became caliph, a group of these piety-minded felt a very particular bond to Ali. This was a very personal bond between Ali and these followers from the piety-minded. And this took place, or this bond was cemented in particular on two occasions when oaths were taken, when groups of people took oaths saying that they would follow Ali unconditionally. But recall, this is only Ali. Ali is who is being followed. And that bond has been referred to by many people, including Maria Dukaki, as walaya. Walaya can mean lots of things. Okay, walaya has a range of meanings. But in this case, it's a charismatic bond that this group of people felt specifically with Ali. Okay, now would this extend beyond Ali? They didn't know. We didn't know. Chances are it did extend somewhat beyond Ali, because after Ali was killed, his sons, Hassan Hussein, and even his third son, Muhammad ibn al-Hanafiya, they retained some of these followers. But charisma cannot be perpetuated, it can't remain, it dies away. You can't just have a state or a bond based solely on the charisma of one man. And so one could argue that at least until the death of Hussein, that charismatic bond was there. But at some point, that charismatic bond would have to be solidified. It would have to change. As Weber would say, it would have to be institutionalized. But we don't know if it was. All we know is this bond existed between this group of people and Ali. We know that it was probably still there at the time of Karbala and Hussein's death. We don't know what happened after that. For the most part, it's all very murky. So I've taken you 61 years into the first century, and I have nothing more to tell you about that first century. Because whatever happened from Hussein's death in 681 to the start of the next century, really the next 40 years, is largely grounded in mystery, is not clear. So here we have the first stage. We can call these people Shia. In fact, they're referred to as Shia. These individuals who have a personal bond with Ali. Nothing more than that. It's not about the family yet, really. It's just about these people and this person. Okay, so that's it. That's most of the history I'm going to give you, so I apologize for all of that. Now I want to turn to the second thing, the second area, and that is the emergence of communal identity. Okay, so we have a gap here. We have a gap from when Hussein dies to the fifth Shi'i Imam, for the 12ers anyway, and that would be Muhammad al-Baqir and Ja'far as-Sadiq. Now, things are a little bit different in the second century. And the reason they're different is because we, as historians, finally have access now to sources that can tell us something about what's going on. It's no longer a black box. We have more literary sources, but these sources are somewhat different in nature. They don't tell us what happened. They tell us things about ritual. They tell us how to pray. They tell us whether you can drink alcohol or not, or what type of alcohol you can drink. They tell us things like that. They tell you how you can dress. So these are about ritual. They're very much about what you practice, about what you can do. And so when we're looking at the early second century, our whole focus becomes one of ritual as opposed to belief. We can't really dissect belief yet. Now there's a good chance that ritual was coming from belief, but that dynamic is slightly complicated. I'm going to leave that aside for now. Now, what I'm going to say now isn't specific to Shias again. It's about the community as a whole. When Islam expands, and once you have geographical centers in different places, people begin to practice in different ways. All right? So when you're in Kūfa, it's really far from Medina. It might not seem so much today, but back then it really was. So ritual began to be different. There were slight differences that were introduced in Quranic recitation. There were slight differences that were introduced in lots of different ways. Ritual became diversified. And one of the ways that that affected the Muslim world, or the Shia in particular, was that the Shia assumed for themselves a very specific and different type of ritual practice. Now, first thing I want to do, though, is to establish how important ritual was in this period. What ritual meant. Why how you prayed was so important. Actually, I can't tell you why, but I can tell you that it was. I can show you that it was. And for that, I have this hadith. Now, it's taken from Darimi, who dies in 255, so about 100 years after the period that I'm interested in. But trust me, the Germans have proven that this is reliable for the early 2nd century. So the text reads as follows. We would follow the man from whom we wanted to transmit traditions, to observe him when he prayed. If he knew how to perform the prayer expertly, we would sit down with him and say, he must be correct in other matters. But if he performed the prayer incorrectly, we would move away from him and say, he is wrong in other matters. The idea here is that when you wanted to go to someone for authority, for religious knowledge, what you would do is you wouldn't have to ask them, hey, so what do you think about this? How do you think about God's attributes? Those kinds of questions, theological questions weren't asked. What was done is people would observe their ritual, and that ritual was shorthand for what their positions were. So if you wanted to know if you could transmit from someone a tradition, a hadith, what you would do is you could watch them pray. And if you saw how their hands were, if you saw what they said, how they recited things, you knew right away where their loyalties lay and whether you could trust them or whether you couldn't trust them. Now for the Shia, this comes into play because what the Shia begin to do is develop a set of rituals that aren't so different from the non-Shi'i population, but which are distinctive to them. So to give you an example, at the start of prayer, you have the basmallah. Do you say Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim out loud? Do you say it silently? Do you not say it at all? Now, all Muslim groups, Sunni, well, I shouldn't say Sunni yet, non-Shi'i and Shi'i, had their own positions on this. The Shi'i position seemed to be that you said the Bismillah out loud, no matter what. It didn't matter if the rest of the recitation was silent. For the Shia, however, they also had a second ritual difference, and that was how they did the wudu. They had a third ritual difference, a very specific position, on whether you did the qunut in prayer, the qunut being either a curse or an invocation that is inserted after the recitation in the prayer. Now, each of these ritual positions themselves aren't so distinctive, but taken together, they reflected a very specific Shi'i identity. So we have ritual differences, and now these ritual differences became associated with places. So this is the second thing that begins to happen in the 2nd century. So we have a tradition such as this. I'm not going to read the whole thing, but I will read part of it. In our presence, a man asked Sharik, what is your opinion regarding a man whose door is located near a mosque where the qunut is not performed, while behind the mosque is another mosque where the qunut is performed? He responded, he should go to the mosque where the qunut is performed. He then asked, what is your opinion regarding a man who affirms the qunut but forgets to perform it? He responded, he should perform 2 prostrations of forgetfulness. Now, I'm not going to read the rest. It's not even, the point here isn't even that of the qunut. The point here is that mosques were becoming associated with rituals. So suddenly there were places where you knew, if you attended this place, if you went to a particular mosque, that the ritual would be performed, that the prayer would be performed in a very specific way. And so there's 2 steps happening here. The first step is a ritual difference. The second step is marrying that ritual difference to a location. And so different mosques functioned in different ways. So I have this unreadable map for you. And the reason I have it is it points out a little bit about how spaces were being carved. So I'm going to just point a couple of things out. These dark squares in Kūfa are places where Shi'i literature, pilgrimage manuals tell you, if you happen to be in Kūfa, don't go there. Because those are hostile mosques. They will not treat you well. But these round circles out here, these are friendly mosques. So you should definitely go there, because those are friendly mosques. And the idea here was that if you wanted like a lonely planet Kūfa in the 8th century, the way you would go about doing it is they would tell you which mosque to go to and which mosque not to go to. Now in early pilgrimage manuals in the 3rd century, or sorry, in the 2nd century, in the 2nd, 8th century, what we find is a very clear designation of friendly and accursed mosques. Now friendly mosques are friendly mosques because of tribal associations. Certain tribes were friendly to Shi'is. Other tribes were not friendly to Ali. Really, eventually went back down to Ali himself. And in other places, you have this indication that certain mosques were renovated after Hussein was killed in celebration. You don't want to go to that mosque if you're a Shi'i, because chances are you're not going to find friends. Okay? So in the beginning, we have this ritual and we have this space, friendly space. This is what I would call sacred space. So sacred spaces are being carved out for Shias where they will be able to perform the prayers or their prayers in a way that they will be comfortable with. Now, a second stage happens here. I promise you up to 3 stages. The second stage happens here, and that is that the mosques that are friendly start to acquire a sacredness. They're seen as not just friendly because, hey, the tribe is a nice tribe. They're blessed. They're religiously significant. So we have accounts such as these that emerge, and this is, again, a relatively early account. There are blessed and accursed mosques in Kūfa. As for the blessed ones, they include Masjid Ghani. It is a blessed mosque. By God, its prayer niche is oriented correctly. It was founded by a believer and is in the center of the earth at a good location. Nights and days will not end until spring bursts out within it and until there are 2 gardens on its side. That's a reference to the end times. As for those of its people who are damned, it will be denied them. Masjid Jufi is a blessed mosque. Often people from the wilderness gather in it and pray. Masjid Bani Zafar is a blessed mosque. By God, its dome contains a green stone, and God does not send a prophet without inscribing his face upon it. There are also Masjid Salah and Masjid Hamra, which is also known as Masjid Yunus, from which bursts a spring, which is realized in the marshes and the regions around it. As for the accursed mosques, there is Masjid al-Ashat, Masjid Jarir, Masjid Taqif, Masjid Simak, and Masjid al-Hamra. This one different from the other Masjid al-Hamra because it's constructed on the grave of a pharaoh. Okay, the idea here is that these mosques are no longer just friendly or hostile. These mosques are now blessed or accursed. And this extends to other mosques as well. I mean, there's an indication that the central mosque in Kūfa, for example, is a place where a recitation of 2 rak'ah, 2 cycles, is worth 1,000. I mean, so the idea here being that Masjid Kūfa is also a place where a bunch of prophets have been buried. I mean, these mosques begin to acquire a significance that extends beyond simply friendliness or hostility. And what I would say here is that we're not talking about sacred space anymore. Now we're talking about a sacred geography. It's more than just mosques. And this is reflected in other ways as well, because at this point, in the late 2nd century and the early 3rd century, not only are these places seen as sacred, not only are they blessed or cursed, now pilgrimage manuals tell you, don't just go here and go there. They tell you, go to these mosques in this order. Right? First go here, then go here, then go here, then there. And these are the prayers you should do at each stop. The point here is that space is changing and rituals are changing. The ritual is separating the community, and then spaces are being apportioned by that community. And in this, we begin to see the beginnings of a Shi'i communal identity. I'm not saying that these are Shia in the sense that we think of Shia today. It doesn't mean that their belief structures are the same, but what it means is that a group has begun to see itself as different. It's begun to set itself apart. The last step in this is pilgrimage. And this is when mosques become overshadowed, you could say, by a different type of place. And that would be a tomb or a shrine. And that begins to happen a little bit later. Now, you might ask, well, why would someone choose to replace a mosque or a set of mosques, those spaces, with a shrine or with a tomb? Well, the idea here is that a tomb, such as the tomb of Ali in Najaf, or the tomb of Hussein, is a space that it does not have to be shared with anyone else. It is a distinctive Shi'i space. So what you begin to have is pilgrimages to these shrines becoming more important than visits to these mosques. And so traditions emerge, such as this tradition here, from Sheikh Mufid, fairly late. If one of you performs the Hajj in the course of your lifetime and does not visit Hussein, then you have departed from one of the claims of God and the messenger of God. Because the claim of Hussein is a mandatory duty from God, exalted and mighty, and obligatory upon every Muslim. So here you begin to see that what matters are these locations. What matters are pilgrimages one carries out. I can give you multiple examples of individuals, in fact, who are known to have had beliefs that were somewhat problematic, but were accepted as Shia, simply because they took part in processions that once a year would go to these shrines. So this public demonstration of your identity became more important than even what you believed. And in this we see the work of a sociologist, a modern sociologist, Pierre Bourdieu, who argues that identity doesn't necessarily, it can't really coalesce around beliefs necessarily. It has to be visible. You have to be able to see it. It has to be a marker. So if you're in Kūfa, which is where most of these people, most Shia lived, then as soon as you saw someone, you almost immediately, depending on which mosque they were going, who they were hanging out with, where they were, which shrines they were visiting, how they were praying, you immediately knew who they were. One didn't have to interrogate someone's belief structure. One could just visibly know. And that's how Shi'i identity begins to coalesce in the 2nd century. It's not, I wouldn't call it Shi'ism the way we think of it today, but I would say that these groups begin to see themselves as different. And again, just to recap, we have a 3-pronged thing happening here. In the early 2nd century, we have ritual, and the ritual matters significantly. Then we move on to sacred spaces. So we end up with friendly and hostile mosques, and then we have those mosques endowed with a very particular religious significance. This is almost a transition from sacred space to sacred geography. And finally, we have pilgrimage, where pilgrimage or shrines begin to replace, in some way, begin to replace mosques. Now, as you can tell, this isn't just in the 2nd century, but these processes begin in the 2nd century. So by the time of the 5th and 6th Imams for the 12er Shia, Baqir and Sadiq, we really have a community that has come into its own as different, as not part of the greater whole. But what their belief structures were, still not clear. And I can't really comment too much on that because I'm trying to limit myself, as I said in the very beginning, to things we kind of know. And when it comes to belief structures, it's a little bit more problematic in this period. Now, the third thing I want to talk about is that belief structure. So I really want to talk about theological constructions. Now, in order to speak about this coherently, there's something that we need to talk about what the Shi'i community looked like. Not just that it was different or separated off in the 2nd, 8th century, but how was it, what were the beliefs of these groups themselves? Now, today we tend to have, there are 3 Shi'i communities that predominate. There are Ismailis, there are Zaydis, and there are Twelvers, or Ithna Shi'is. Now, early on, this was not necessarily the case. There were a lot of Shi'i communities. There was a multiplicity of groups. They held varying positions about the role of the 5th and the 6th Imam in particular. That's when these identities began to coalesce. So al-Baqir and al-Sadiq. Some people believe that Sadiq and Baqir and Sadiq and the other Imams were almost deified. Some believe that they held a very exalted position. Others held that they were, just like normal people, but they had great knowledge. There were rationalist positions. There were supernaturalist positions. There was a wide range. And most of these groups existed in Kūfa. There's a problem here with being in Kūfa, or an advantage, you could say. And that is that the Imams of these communities were living in Medina. But the community as a whole was in Kūfa. And so Imams couldn't maintain control over their followers. They couldn't dictate what to believe and what not to believe. So what we have in Kūfa is many communities, all claiming to be Shia, all holding theologically divergent views about the authority of the Imam. Who is the Imam? How do you find the Imam? What does the Imam believe? All these were all open questions. There's mass diversity in the 2nd century. Things begin to change with the 3rd and 9th century as theology, and by theology what I really mean is belief, as belief begins to coalesce in a very different way. The last thing I'll say about this diversity is this, and this is going to feed into what I want to talk about now, which is theology. And that is that if you were to put Shi'ism on a spectrum in Kūfa in the 2nd, 8th century, on one end you would find people who held very supernaturalist ideas about the Imams. At the other end you would find people who held very rationalist ideas about the Imam. But what I mean by this is the supernaturalists believed in many ways that the Imams were created in primordial time, that they weren't deified, but they were very close. They were really superhuman in many ways. Whereas on the other side, you had lots of people who felt that Imams, or Shi'i Imams, had learned knowledge, but they were good scholars. They were good people. Their imamate could be explained rationally. They had the most knowledge. So this is the spectrum that we're talking about. I'm going to focus for the rest of this talk on 12er Shi'ism, in particular, the Ithna Shi'is. And for the Ithna Asharis, the way these two extremes were brought together was through Mu'tazilism, so Mu'tazili theology. So what I'm interested here in this third section is how Twelver Shi'ism came to adopt a Mu'tazili theological edifice. And you're welcome in advance. I will not talk too much about Mu'tazilism because it's very complicated. But I will try to at least chart out the narrative through which Mu'tazilism becomes so important for Twelver Shi'as. Now, in this process, the first two people we need to think about are Zurara ibn Ayyan and Hisham ibn Hakam. Now, as you can see by their death dates, 763 and 796, these are figures who lived during the times of the Imams themselves. So Zurara was a companion of the fifth Imam, al-Baqir, and Hisham was a companion of the sixth Imam, as-Sadiq, primarily. Now, these figures were theologians. They would fall on the rationalist side of that spectrum. And what they did is they attempted to defend the Imams and the position of their Imams against attacks by theologians. So they themselves put forward their own ideas about who the Imam is and what the Imam's powers are, what the Imam's authority is, where the Imam comes from. But to some extent, they were bound by the fact that the Imam existed. So if the Imam existed, remember, the Imam's authority is such that if the Imam says that we believe in A, then we believe in A. And if the Imam says we believe in B, then we believe in B. So from what we know, Baqir and Sadiq really tried not to take strong theological positions. But they took some of their companions and authorized them to defend their community, which at this point wasn't Twelver. It was, I would say, Imami, sort of Ismailis and Twelvers together. For the most part, these two figures would put forward their own theology, try to stay as far from the Imam as possible, and defend the Imam's position against primarily Mu'tazilis. Now, everything changes with the disappearance of the Imam in 874, the disappearance of the 12th Imam. And at this point, the community's theological and belief structure is no longer in the hands of the Imams. In many ways, it is now in the hands of the community itself. So the scholars have more authority to take positions that they would not otherwise take. And now we begin to see a slow movement within Shi'ism towards an adoption of Mu'tazilism. So in the first few people who seem to fall into this category are the two Nobaktis, Abu Sa'al and Hassan ibn Musa, and Ibn Qibba. And both of these are figures, as you can see, in the 4th, 10th century, the late 3rd, 9th century. Now, these folks did not establish or take on Mu'tazilism as a whole, but what they did is they tried to use Mu'tazili ways of debating a particular theological edifice to defend Twelver Shi'i positions. So you think that the Imam can't be like this, well, I'm going to argue that the Imam can, and I'm going to do it using your own methods of argumentation. So essentially what these figures were doing in Baghdad, and I call them early adopters because they're taking some aspects of Mu'tazilism, but they're primarily defensive in posture. They're still defending, but they're using the methods of the Mu'tazilis. This begins to change later, especially with these final three figures, Ibn Babawayh, Sheikh Mufid, and Sharif al-Murtada. One was a student of the next, and the next was a student of the next, so I mean, they're all related intellectually. And to understand how and in what way they brought about an adoption of Mu'tazilism, large sections of Mu'tazilism, not all of Mu'tazilism, I'm just going to give you a very brief survey of each. Ibn Babawayh, who dies in 991, he uses Mu'tazilism primarily. What he tries to do is adopt those elements of Mu'tazilism that no one else speaks to, no Imam speaks to. Mufid does similar kinds of things. So if Mu'tazilis believe that God is just in a way that we can understand, Sheikh Mufid in particular, but even Ibn Babawayh to an extent, will say, oh, we can accept that, as long as there's no statement from an Imam that says we can't accept that. So what they begin to do is appropriate those parts of Mu'tazilism that don't explicitly contradict their own beliefs about the Imam. But when they eventually hit brick walls, because if Twelver Shi'is believe that the Imams can intercede on behalf of their followers, or if Twelver Imams believe that Twelver Shi'is believe that their Imams have infallibility or inerrancy, isma, then they can't defend that. So what they do is they take from Mu'tazilis what they can, and for the other things they say, this is our beliefs and our beliefs are different from yours. This changes with the most important figure on this list, who is Sharif al-Murtada, who dies in 1044. And what Sharif al-Murtada does, is he says, I can show you, on the basis of reason and rationality, a way to affirm every aspect of Twelver Shi'ism. And then he goes about doing it. And if I really wanted to torture you, I could do that too. I mean, he goes through the whole system very, very, very clearly. So it begins with Adha, the justice of God, and he takes it all the way down to the imams, what the imam's powers are, that the imam must be appointed, that the imam is perfect, what the imam's knowledge is. He proves all of this in the logic of rationality. And he does it primarily using Mu'tazili doctrines. By this point, the only real difference between the Mu'tazilis and the Twelvers rests on the position of the imams and the idea of intercession. But really, the larger edifice of Mu'tazilism by this point has been incorporated into Twelver Shi'ism. Now, I want to take a step back here. If we argue, or if we agree, that Sharif al-Murtada, and things change after him as well, I'm just putting this as an endpoint for this talk today. If we agree that Sharif al-Murtada marks sort of a coming together of most aspects of Mu'tazilism and Twelver Shi'ism, and that this theological edifice is now in place, one has to think about what that does to how a community remembers its past. Okay? And here we come full circle. It's almost like it's like a cat chasing its tail kind of an issue here. And once we have a theological edifice in place, the history of the community has to reflect that edifice. Those beliefs have to be apparent within the way a community remembers its past. And so, to give you a quick example of this, if we look at the story of Hussein at Karbala, you don't have to read that, I apologize for how small it is. If you look at the story of Hussein at Karbala, and many of you know this story. So Hussein is intercepted by an Umayyad army. The governor of Kūfa at the time is Ibn Ziyad. He sends a force led by Ibn Sa'd. They both require Hussein to take an oath of allegiance to Yazid ibn Muawiyah in Damascus. Hussein refuses, and essentially what we end up having is a massacre of Hussein and his family in 681. Now, if we look at the earliest sources we have of this account of Hussein, what we find is that the real bad guy in this story is Ibn Ziyad. Because Ibn Ziyad kind of had issues with Ali, and he was taking it out, according to the earliest accounts, on Hussein. He would take no other answer except full submission. Ibn Sa'd, who was the head of the Kufan army, had to go. He was reluctant, but he went about, and Hussein was killed. But really, the story is one of loyalty. The Kufans call the imam, then the Kufans abandon the imam, and this governor is responsible for it. And Yazid feels bad about it, but Yazid isn't necessarily the bad guy. He's not the villain in the account. But within the Shi'i sources, one could argue that early on, that same account is somewhat preserved. So when we look at a figure like Mufid, or even before Mufid at Kulaini, what we find is that narrative is still there. But that's because the belief structure, the theology, hasn't solidified yet. So what we have is a story of Karbala that is very much a story of loyalty and very much a condemnation of Ibn Ziyad. But as the theology changes, as Mufid adopts a Mu'tazilism, as the community as a whole adopts a Mu'tazili belief structure, as their views about what an imam is and how an imam is chosen solidify, then the story changes. So suddenly, the point of Karbala is no longer about this man who stands up for a principle and is killed for it. Suddenly, Mufid's biography, remember, he was one of the individuals who brought about the adoption of Mu'tazilism. Suddenly, the story has an emphasis on the appointment of Hussein. He had to be appointed imam. Suddenly, his knowledge is expanded. He had to have that kind of knowledge. Suddenly, his control of the situation is much more extensive. Hussein is fitted into the model of belief structures that the community at that point has adopted. So the memory of the community changes as its belief structure evolves. And we see this even later with the Safavids. In the Safavid period, what we find is that the Safavids make Yazid the bad guy. Suddenly, it is a polarizing issue of good versus evil. Suddenly it becomes almost a Sunni-Shi'i issue. So what I'm trying to point out here is that the way the community remembers its early history is shaped very much by the theology and belief structure that they themselves eventually adopt. And so we have a sort of a circular issue here. We begin with the history I told you. We go to the formation of that identity, and then we go to their adoption of a theology which shifts its history. So these things evolve over time. And that's what makes it so difficult for us to figure out what goes on early on, because that everything we have about that early period is colored in some way by later beliefs. Now, I want to take a step back here for a second. The narrative that I've given you, a narrative where you begin with a community that's grounded in this idea of a charismatic bond with Ali, and then you have this community solidifying around ritual and spaces, and then you have this community establishing an edifice of theology that gives reason and logic to its belief structure, that then shapes the way it remembers the past, can equally be said about almost any other group in Islam. I've done this for you for Shi'ism, but the same thing can be done for Sunnism. If we go back to this slide here of the piety-minded, one could make the argument that Sunni identity and Sunnism emerges from, and it does, from that very same group of the pious, people who sought a very particular view of what it meant to be Muslim, a universalist vision. And over time, they too developed ritual differences. And we had schools of law that emerged on the basis of that. And they too eventually adopted a theological position that emerged later than the Shi'i position. And some would argue in opposition to the Shi'i position. The Shi'i position and the Kharijite positions came first. And if you come to the next talk, and I will plug it here, which is, I believe, on the Kharijites, the Ibadis, then you'll hear about that. But these groups developed their own identities in this way. And then they rewrote their own histories. So this isn't something specific to Shi'ism. This is something universal. But what it does do is it gives the lie to very simplistic notions we have about how these communities emerged. So if we think about that very first narrative, the Prophet dies. Some people choose Ali, some people choose Abu Bakr. Yes, that history is present, but that history is very much a competition between Sunni and Shi'i, a competition that comes much, much later, once the theological beliefs are solidified. And so for us to try to decipher that is very problematic. What it does is it gives us a simple answer that cuts through immense complicatedness. It is very, very messy. But I hope that at the very minimum you can see, on the basis of this presentation, how Shi'i identity emerged over time, and through it, how Sunni identity emerged over time, and how Ibadi identity emerged over time, and how all identities emerge over time. And it should make us think about how belief structures affect the way the past is remembered and written. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks a lot for the enlightening talk. What I take from your talk is primarily the complexity by which identity is formed. And I wanted to get some of your thoughts on perhaps another theory that comes within this complexity that you outlined. And I don't take any definitive views myself, but I'd be interested in what you have to say. I remember reading an autobiographical account by someone known as Muhammad Asad, a famous convert to Islam, called Road to Mecca. And he puts forward a theory as to how Shi'i Islam was further institutionalized and why specifically it developed as it did in the region of Persia. And also certain rituals that came to be associated with the institutionalization of Shi'i Islam as it developed. And he cites why the region in particular is being an instance of that, and also the demonization of Umar. And his reasoning is that it was during Umar's Khilafah, during his reign, that the Persian Empire with all its glories fell to the Muslims. And he puts forward almost a psyche of, which is what many people would sort of associate with Shia Islam in a distinguishing element from Sunni Islam, a sense of melancholy, because a lot of Sunnis would consider all the events that are considered the definitive events of Shia Islam as being tragedies. But it's almost as if they're central to the identity of Shia Islam, the necessity to remember the tragedy of Karbala and to reenact that tragedy and to have that state of sadness and melancholy, state of sadness. And Muhammad Asad's point is it's almost a substitute for the loss of the glories of the Persian Empire. So I just wanted to, and Omar is centrally demonized, through ritualistic poetry and so on. So I just wanted to know if you had any thoughts on that.
Well, I would say a couple of things. The first thing I would say is that seems to me very reminiscent of that same idea that's often put out there, which is that Shi'ism is a foreign version of Islam. And I don't think that it in any way is. I don't even think of Shi'ism as a sect. I think of it as a co-orthodoxy. There are two definitive ways of looking at, more than two probably, two predominant ways today of looking at the source material itself. And if you spin it one way, you get Shi'ism, and if you spin it a different way, you get Sunnism. The second thing I would say is that this idea of Persia and the Persian Empire as being foundational to Shi'ism is, I think, really it's distortive, I would say, because for most of Islamic history, the vast majority of the scholars as well as the communities that were Shi'i were Arab. I mean, Iran only becomes Shi'i in the 16th century. And prior to that, the centers for Shi'ism were in Syria, Lebanon, Iraq, even Arabia. Hijaz was a Shi'i area. So there's that. Another thing I would say is that we shouldn't just make the Twelver Shi'i experience the normative experience, because the Zaydis do not feel the same way. The Zaydis are quite activist. I've been to Zaydi parties. They're very joyous, as are some Twelver parties. So, I mean, it's not just about mourning. Mourning is important, but that mourning can be turned in very different ways. If you look at, for example, how Ibn Babawayh tells the stories of the Imams, it's not one of mourning or silence or oppression. He tells the life of Musa Kazim and Ali Rida, for example, as one of opposition and power. So, I mean, there are other ways of thinking about this. We shouldn't just make normative the last couple hundred years in the Persian context and read it backwards. And as much as I love Muhammad Asad, as much as I love Talal Asad more than Muhammad Asad, I will say that I think that's a profoundly distorted way of thinking about it.
Listening to your topic, I mean, maybe I'm wrong, and I know you're a historian. You basically rely on sources, and as you said, there's difficulty with early Islamic sources. It sounds like a social movement to me. Mm-hmm. What we, as a public, when we grow up, we realize that this is a political movement. What do you think? Is this a social movement, or is this a power struggle? That's why Shi'ism evolved, because of power struggle, or is it because of the social problems in the society?
I mean, what I would argue, what I would say is that this separating the social from the political, from the religious in the early period is very difficult to do. We have very little understanding of the dynamics that were at play. Tribalism seems to be the easiest way to discuss it, but that's not the only way. I shied away from belief structures in the first century and a half because I'm just not certain about them, and so I don't speak of them. But belief mattered a great deal, and even ritual, and even some of these other forces that I bring up, you have to realize that they tie back to a belief in an imam, and that imam, that belief in an imam is a very religious belief. But with that comes an idea that the imam should hold power. And so to separate the religious from the political in that way is quite difficult. And if you believe that the imam is the rightful imam, and as many traditions say, will fill the earth with justice to the extent that it is full of oppression, then the social gets brought in too. The social justice aspects get brought in too. So it's all mixed up in the early period, and the separation that I did do was just for clarity purposes. It's very hard to separate these streams out in actuality.
I wondered if you could give us a sort of a dictionary definition of how the notion of isma is different or modulates between through history and then between the various groups within Islam.
Oh, is that all?
Yeah. Well, just, you know. No, I just suspected there was a difference.
Okay, well, I will. That's a book waiting to be written. The notion of isma, but I will say this: it seems that in the, I will. It can mean multiple things. In some instances, one could make an argument that for both Sunnis and Shi'is, isma was seen early on as a purity that's bestowed upon a person by God. So Maryam, for example, is described in those terms in the Quran. So it's not just a prophet. It could be someone who's just bestowed a purity in that way. Now, within the Shi'i context, the two extreme positions are the supernaturalist position and the rationalist position. Now, what Shi'is believe today is modulated in the middle of those. But to give you an idea of the spectrum, the rationalists believe that all isma was inerrancy. And what that meant was that God protected the legal judgments and the theological judgments that the imams gave from being in error. So it was not possible for an imam to make an error in a legal judgment or in taking a theological position. That was the rationalist position because they tried to explain, because their whole idea of isma was grounded in the necessity of proper guidance, and that was taken from Mu'tazilism. The supernaturalist position was quite different, and that meant that the imam was perfect, almost to the point where the imam was superhuman. And the imam had absolute knowledge, and the imam could never even conceive of there's not even a possibility of the imam making any mistake in any way. So it's an absolute perfection, the perfect man. So here you have, in the spectrum, you have the perfect man on one side, and you have the perfect scholar, almost, on the other. And Shi'ism eventually modulates between the two and finds a position in the middle. So I hope that answers that question.
Yeah, thanks again for your talk. There's a common narrative in Shi'ism about oppression. And you mentioned the three scholars and the migration of Mu'tazilism into Shi'ism. You mentioned Ibn Babawayh, Sheikh Suduk, Al-Mufid, and then later Al-Murtada and Al-Tusi after.
Mm-hmm.
But what you didn't mention is the context in which those scholars operated, which was the rise of Shia government across the entirety of the Muslim world, in particular in the core of the Muslim world with the Buwayhids, Al-Buwayhiyun. Sheikh Suduk in particular had a pension from Rukn al-Dawla al-Buwayhi at the Dawla, supported Sheikh Mufid. So what's missing, I think, in the discussion is not just an intellectual migration, but it's also the migration from the shadows into public political life of those same scholars in their leadership role, especially Al-Murtada, who established the legitimacy for Shias to operate a government in the absence of the Imam. So maybe if you could comment a little bit on the context of that transition, it would add to your lecture.
No, thank you so much. You're absolutely right. This is reflected, for example, in biographical works. So when you see Kulaini, who's operating in a very different world, tell the biographies of the imams for him. He's very close to occultation. He's at a time where the Shi'i community is still oppressed in Baghdad. Then he tells a story, he tells a biography of oppression. He tells a biography of struggle. But when we get to Ibn Babawayh and when we get to Mufid, it's completely shifted. So this is another thing that I could talk about, and I have spoken about in other places, and that is how the contemporary circumstances of the community affect the telling of history, and the way the community positions itself. And this actually connects to another idea, and that is that I say that the community rewrites its past, right? This is not to trick you, Okay, this is not to trick us. The audiences for these works were not deceived. They understood that the reworking of history was something that was occasionally done. It was done because it was part of a broader rhetorical tradition that allowed you to change things and shift things and make arguments within the telling of a historical work. But getting back to your question, I think you're absolutely right. I mean, there's a fundamental shift that begins to happen once the Buyids come to power, because the community is newly empowered, and the community is suddenly patronized, and it's free to operate in ways that it wasn't free to operate previously. And that doesn't last forever, but it lasts for it comes at a very critical time for Twelver Shi'ism. And I think it's a period that's very understudied, the Buyid period for Twelver Shi'ism. And so I take that comment.
I have a quick question. From the supernatural aspect, the 12th Shi'ism, is there a belief that the 12th Imam is still hidden?
Well,
is that true?
That's not just Twelver. That's not a supernatural. That's a central doctrine for Twelver Shi'ism, is that the 12th Imam went into occultation and remains in occultation, and will return at some point.
As a figure of speech, or a physical thing, or a real fact?
You're trying to get me in trouble, but I'm not going to fall for it.
I'm interested because I'm 50 years old. I mean, I ask people, nobody really knows.
No, they say
the true answer. So you are an expert. Do you think?
I'm not an expert. I will say this: that there are a vast majority of Twelver Shi'as believe that it's a physical occultation, and so they await a physical return. There have been some scholars in the past, the Twelver Shi'i scholars, who have taken the occultation to be more spiritual. A prime example of this would be Allama Tabatabai, who's a more modern scholar, who made the argument that it may, he didn't say it was, he said it may be a spiritual occultation, but he's in a very small minority who make that kind of an argument.